Chapter 3, Biological Macromolecules. In Chapter 3, we have examples and descriptions of the important biological macromolecules that we find in organisms. There are four major categories. Sometimes I call them food groups, but they're really not just foods. Carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids are the four major biochemical macromolecule groups that we find that are used in the construction of all organisms on Earth. We'll discuss in more detail nucleic acids when we get to Units 3 and 4 this semester and talk about genetics. For now, we'll focus on the first three groups, the carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. All are important in the construction of organisms, and we'll see each has its own unique contribution when it comes to either forming an organism or providing a source of food for organisms. Macromolecule. Macro meaning big, molecule meaning a structure formed from atoms of different elements to make a piece of matter. Macromolecules are often described as polymers. Polymer means a big thing, a big structure that's composed of individual building blocks that we call monomers. So a monomer is like a brick in a wall. So if, let's say, we have a brick wall, the individual bricks would be the monomers. The wall itself, composed of bricks, would be the polymer. When we're talking about macromolecules, we have to chemically bond the monomers together to form the polymer. Each individual group of biochemicals that are used in the formation of organisms often have special names for the types of covalent bonds that are used to link the monomers together to make the polymers. And we're going to use chemical reactions, forming chemical bonds, to make those polymers from the building block monomers. The two general categories of chemical reactions show us why water is important in biological systems, in biological organisms. Because we're going to see in the formation of polymers, every time we chemically bond one monomer to another, we're removing water in the process. That's the dehydration chemical reactions that are important when we're building polymers. On the other hand, if we're taking those polymers apart, chemists often use the word hydrolysis, but I find it's easier for students to remember what's actually occurring if we use the word hydration. If we are hydrating ourselves, if we've done a lot of activities and we're thirsty because of the activity, we're going to hydrate ourselves by drinking water. We're going to add water to our bodies. Well, in a hydration chemical reaction, that's essentially what's happening. Water is added to the chemical reaction while the polymer is being broken down into individual monomers. Again, that goes back to one of the important properties of water as a universal solvent and participating in the chemical reactions in an organism. So dehydration, removing a water when we're putting the monomers together to make polymers. Hydration, we're going to add water to the chemical reactions when we're taking that polymer and breaking it down into individual monomers. Dehydration and hydration reactions. Here's a very simple illustration of two monomers. And so we have some building blocks. And you can see where in red the atoms of the different parts of these two monomers are each going to contribute one molecule of water when we chemically bond them together. If you follow this link to the website, and again, you can find the active link on the regular PowerPoint, then there's a little animation that shows you or illustrates the dehydration hydration reactions that can occur when we're taking individual monomers and linking them together with covalent bonds to form polymers. These are the general steps that are going to occur when we're building carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids in organisms. For the four major classes of macromolecules, of biochemicals, the name of the polymer, and the building blocks. make sure that you know these bits of information. So carbohydrates are the polymers. You might have even heard the word polysaccharide. Saccharide means sugar. Poly means many sugars, because sugars are the monomers or building blocks for carbohydrates, or also called polysaccharides. For lipids, lipids actually have a more diverse source of monomers. We can include structures like fatty acids, glycerols, and even sterol types of chemical structures for monomers. For proteins, proteins also have, like carbohydrates, sort of individual building blocks. Those are called amino acids. So carbohydrates we're going to build from sugars. Proteins we're going to build from amino acids. Lipids, we have a few more choices for building blocks for lipids. For nucleic acids, again, it's a little bit more straightforward. Like carbohydrates and proteins, nucleic acids do have individual building blocks that we call nucleotides. All of these biological, biochemical groups are called organic molecules. The original concept for organic chemistry was many years ago, probably hundreds of years ago now. Probably scientists were looking at what kind of chemical construction has been used to make organs in an animal or a human being. Well, nowadays we know that organic chemistry is not just chemicals from body organs, but what was learned, again, a few 100 or so years ago, is that when you took these structures and you broke them down into their most basic components, they found a lot of carbon. And so now organic chemistry is the chemistry of carbon-based molecules and compounds, which of course is what we find in organisms. They all contain carbon. They're also going to contain hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen in fairly large proportions. And then the remainder of the structure of an organism are trace elements, or very tiny amounts of other types of elements, like calcium, magnesium. There's a wide variety of the roughly less than 10% of the structure of an organism that's made up of all the other elements that could possibly be used, compared to the roughly 94 to 96% that's usually the big four: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Here we have an example of a dehydration reaction in the formation of a carbohydrate. It's called a disaccharide. So individual sugars are called saccharides, or monosaccharides. Monosaccharides, mono meaning one, saccharide meaning sugar. If we link the two together, form a chemical bond between two monosaccharides, we're going to form what's called a disaccharide. That prefix di means two. It's a dehydration chemical reaction. That's really not what's the focus for our point of view here for our course. What's more important than to worry about if it's a hydration or dehydration reaction, we need to keep in mind, and what's important for us, is that if we take two monosaccharides, link them together covalently in a chemical reaction, we produce a disaccharide. And then we're going to give a special name to the covalent bond between those two saccharides that form the disaccharide. We're going to call that chemical bond that's a covalent bond a glycosidic bond. And the glycosidic bond is illustrated by this oxygen that's used as the link, or forming the bridge, between the monosaccharide on the right and the monosaccharide on the left. Is now forming this entire structure that we call a disaccharide. So that's what's important for us to know, is the name of the chemical bond, if there's a special name for that covalent bond, and what are the building blocks, what are the monomers, and do we have larger structures that are made from those monomers, and what are the names for those larger structures. Here we have an example of taking the disaccharide and tearing them apart, chemically speaking. Notice again, water is part of the process. And so that's part of to remind us of the importance of water. Water is always present. Oftentimes in some illustrations, the artists or the editors might leave that water out, and then students wonder, well, where does the hydrogen or the oxygen come from? And when they see these illustrations, so they're just trying to reassure you and reinforce the concept that this isn't all sort of something mysterious happening, that all of the components are there, and they're trying to better illustrate what's happening in the formation of polymers and the breakdown of polymers.